Alex Eala just lost. And normally, that means silence. It means a quiet walk off the court, a small, polite applause, and everyone moves on to the next match. That is not what happened. When Eala walked off that court in Cincinnati, thousands of people stood up. They did not sit quietly. They did not offer some sympathetic clap and go back to their phones. They chanted her name, loud enough that people watching from home noticed it immediately, loud enough that it did not sound like a crowd that had just watched their favorite player lose. So here's the question we need to answer today. Why would a crowd celebrate someone who just lost? Why would they chant her name like she had just won the whole tournament, when the scoreboard says something completely different? This is not a small detail. This is not just some nice moment that happened to get caught on camera. Something happened in that stadium that goes against everything we normally expect from sports fans. Fans cheer winners, they go quiet for losers. That is the rule. Every sport, every era, every country. Win, you get the noise. Lose, you get the silence. Except Alex Eala broke that rule completely. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what happened in that match, what happened after it, and why the answer to this question tells you something much bigger about who Alex Eala actually is right now, not just as a tennis player, but as something the sport has not really seen before. But to understand why this moment is so strange, you first need to understand exactly who Alex Eala is, and exactly how much was on the line when she walked onto that court. This was not some random early round match that nobody was paying attention to. Alex Eala walked into Cincinnati carrying one of the most impressive seasons any young player has put together in years. She is 21 years old. She is from the Philippines. And this year she has beaten 4 different top 10 players. Elena Rybakina, Alina Svitolina, Iga Swiatek, Jessica Pegula. 4 completely different completely different scouting reports. 4 wins that most players never get in an entire career, let alone a single season. Then she went further. She won her first ever WTA title at the Mubadala DC Open, beating Pegula in the final to do it. That run pushed her into the top 20 in the world. 21 years old, top 20, with a resume that reads like someone twice her age and twice her experience. So when she walked into the 3rd round in Cincinnati, this was not a throwaway match. Her opponent was Amanda Anisimova, seeded 9th, ranked 10th in the world, a 2-time Grand Slam finalist. This was a real opportunity. A 5th top 10 win in a single season. Another signature victory to carry into the US Open, which is now just days away. This is exactly the kind of match that should end one of 2 ways. Either Eala wins, and the story is about another statement victory, or Eala loses, and the story is about a promising run hitting a tough wall against a more experienced opponent. Either way, the crowd's reaction should follow the result. That is how it always works. If she had walked off after a straightforward loss and gotten a polite round of applause, nobody would be talking about this today. That would be normal. That would be exactly what everyone expects. I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the part that raises the stakes. We are not talking about a nobody who lost a nothing match and somehow got a nice moment from a few kind fans. We are talking about a player who had a real, meaningful shot at another marquee win, who lost that opportunity, and who still walked off to a reaction that looked nothing like defeat. That gap between what should have happened and what actually happened is exactly where this story lives. And that gap is only about to get stranger, because if you actually watch how this match unfolded, point by point, set by set, you start to realize the crowd had every single reason in the world to go quiet. And they never did. Set 1. Eala comes out sharp. She takes it 6-4. The crowd is loud, standing fully behind her. At this point, everything makes sense. She is winning. Of course they are loud. Then it flips. Anisimova takes the 2nd set, 6-4. Even at this point, you could still explain the crowd noise. The match is tied. There is still hope. Still a reason to believe. But then the third set happens, and this is where the story stops making sense. Anisimova takes it 6-2, and here is the detail that matters most. She does not just win the third set, she wins the final 6 games of the entire match in a row. Not close games. Not games that could have gone either way. 6 straight games, back-to-back, with Eala unable to win a single one of them. Think about what that actually looks like from inside the stadium. You are watching your player go from leading to tied to getting run off the court in the final stretch. 6 games in a row disappearing right in front of you. That is not a nail-biter. That is a collapse. Here is the first mini-question worth asking. If you are sitting in that crowd, watching your player lose 6 straight games to close out the match, at what point do you stop cheering? At what point does the energy in the building start to drain out? Normally, the answer is somewhere around game 3 or 4 of that stretch. The crowd gets quieter. People start checking their phones. Some head for the exits early to beat traffic. That is what losing streaks do to a stadium. It is almost automatic. Except that is not what happened here. By every account from people who were actually there, the energy in that crowd did not fade as Anisimova closed out the match. It held. And when Eala finally walked off the court after that 6-game collapse, the reaction was not the muted, sympathetic applause you would expect after watching your player get run over in the final stretch. It was her name, chanted, loud, sustained. Here is the second mini-question, and this one is harder to answer. If a crowd's energy is supposed to track the scoreboard, moving up when their player wins and fading when their player loses, then what does it mean when the energy simply refuses to follow the pattern? What does it mean when 6 straight lost games produce the same noise level as a set win? There is one more piece to this that makes it even harder to explain away as some fluke of a rowdy crowd. Amanda Anisimova, the player who had just delivered that 6-game collapse, the player who should have been the one soaking up the celebration, was the one who brought up the crowd first, unprompted. In her own post-match interview, before anyone even asked her about it, a winner, describing the atmosphere in the building right after eliminating her opponent and choosing to talk about the crowd instead of her own comeback. At this point, the normal explanations start running out. It is not simply that Eala has passionate fans, plenty of players have passionate fans. It is not simply that the match was close, because it ended with a 6-game collapse that should have deflated any crowd. Something else is going on here. Something that does not fit the usual pattern of how sports crowds behave, and the deeper you look into it, the less it looks like an accident. Here is where you need to throw out the assumption you walked into this video with. Most people watching this story assume the chanting was a consolation prize. A crowd feeling bad for a player who let a lead slip away, trying to lift her spirits on the way out. That is the normal read. That is what almost every article covering this moment implies without saying it directly. It is wrong. Think about what a consolation reaction actually sounds like. It is quiet. It is a little awkward. It is polite applause, maybe a few scattered voices, the kind of sound a crowd makes when they feel sorry for someone. That is not what happened here. What happened here was loud, sustained, and full of energy. The kind of reaction you give someone who just did something remarkable, not someone who just lost 6 games in a row. So, if this was not sympathy, what was it? Here is the reframe. That crowd was not reacting to the scoreboard at all. They were reacting to something much bigger than one match, something that had been building across an entire season, and the scoreline in Cincinnati was never going to be powerful enough to shut it off. Think of it like a concert. If your favorite artist plays a 2-hour show and messes up the final song, you do not walk out angry. You do not sit in silence. You still cheer, because what you showed up for was never just that one song. It was the whole night, the whole experience, the whole reason you became a fan in the first place. One rough ending does not erase that. That is exactly what was happening in that stadium. The people chanting Eala's name were not reacting to a third-set collapse. They were reacting to a season where she beat 4 different top 10 players, a season where she won her first ever title, A season that turned her into one of the most talked about young players in the sport, match after match, city after city. Cincinnati was just one night in a much longer story, and one bad final set was never going to be enough to make that story disappear. This is the aha moment. The loss and the chant were not connected the way everyone assumes. The chant was not a reaction to losing. It was a reaction to everything that happened before the loss. Everything that made people show up in the first place, everything that made this player worth chanting for, even when the scoreboard said something else. And once you see it that way, once you understand that the crowd's loyalty was never tied to that specific result, something else starts to make sense too. This pattern did not start in Cincinnati, and it did not stay confined to the fans in the stands either. Because when you look closer, you find out that even the woman who beat her, the one who delivered that 6-game collapse, saw exactly the same thing the crowd did. If you still think this was just an emotional crowd getting swept up in the moment, here is the proof that changes everything. The first piece of proof comes from the person with the least reason to say anything nice at all, Amanda Anisimova, the woman who just won. In her post-match interview, unprompted, she did not talk about her own comeback. She talked about the atmosphere. She said there was quite a bit of support in that building that night, and that she genuinely appreciated it, because she knew exactly how loved her opponent is, and she added something that matters even more. She said it is for good reason. Read that again. This is not a reporter putting words in her mouth. This is not some polite line she was coached to say. This is a 9-seeded world number 10 player, fresh off eliminating her opponent, choosing to spend part of her own victory interview validating the very player she just beat. Winners do not usually do that. Winners talk about themselves. The second piece of proof is that this was never a one-time thing. This crowd behavior did not appear out of nowhere in Cincinnati. Match after match this season, wherever Eala has played, crowds have shown up in numbers and volume that do not match a player still climbing toward the top 20. That is the part that closes the loop from the very start of this video. The chanting was never really about that one match at all. It was the visible tip of something that had already been building for months. Something that just happened to become undeniable on a night when the scoreboard said loss. Now here is the piece that actually connects everything. Remember the mystery we opened with? Why would a crowd chant a losing player's name like she just won? Here is the answer laid out plainly. The crowd was never emotionally attached to the scoreline in the first place. Their loyalty was built on something the scoreboard cannot touch. It was built on the version of Eala that beat 4 top 10 players this year. It was built on the version of Eala that won her first title weeks earlier. It was built on a season, not a set score. So when that third set slipped away, there was nothing for the crowd to actually lose. The thing they were cheering for was still standing right there in front of them. And here is the small detail almost nobody connects to this story, the one that ties it all together. The respect for Eala is not just coming from the stands, it is coming from her own opponents. The very players who beat her keep describing her the same way the crowd does, not as someone who fell short, as someone who is already, undeniably, one of the players people want to watch. So the mystery is solved. But solving it opens up a much bigger question. If none of this, not the loss, not the 6-game collapse, not any single result, has been enough to shake what people feel about Eala, then what does that actually mean for what comes next? So here is the answer, laid out plainly. The crowd was not chanting despite the loss. They were chanting because the loss was never the point. What that crowd showed up for in Cincinnati was never a single scoreline. It was a season, 4 top 10 wins, a first career title, a 21-year-old who has already proven she belongs in matches like this one. A third set collapse does not erase any of that, and deep down, everyone in that building already knew it. That is why the normal rule of sports did not apply that night. Win, you get the noise. Lose, you get the silence. Except Alex Eala has built something that does not follow that rule anymore. Her value to the people watching her was never tied purely to results. It was tied to who she already is, and who she is clearly becoming. So what does this actually mean going forward? It means the next chapter of this story matters even more than usual, because it is coming almost immediately. Eala has almost no time to rest before the US Open begins. She steps straight from this loss into an exhibition against a fellow rising star, and then into a Grand Slam, where she is projected as a top 20 seed, carrying the exact same crowd, the exact same expectations, and the exact same 9 top 10 wins that got her here in the first place. Here is where we leave this. The question is no longer why a crowd chants for someone who just lost. We answered that. The real question now is what happens the next time Eala walks onto a court with that same crowd behind her, and whether this time, the chanting and the scoreboard finally end up telling the exact same story. If you want to see whether that happens, this is the story to follow closely. Subscribe, because the next chapter starts in just a few days, and you are going to want to see exactly how it plays out.